Sustain 267.
Welcome to the Sustain 267 podcast, where we host conversations on climate change and the environment in Botswana and the rest of Africa. I am your host, Patukile. This is the 8th and sadly final episode of an 8-part series of conversations that we shared with you on the Sustain 267 podcast platform from the 2021 Global Women's Forum on Sustainable Development that was hosted by the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, a feminist organization committed to the full realization of women's human rights through the pursuit of equality. The last episode of this series is titled Green New Deal or New Green Imperialism and was organized by South Feminist Futures. Over the last few years, there have been many discussions about the Green New Deal, including responses and alternative formulations such as the decolonial, feminist, and internationalist Green New Deals. This session was an interactive dialogue between the panel and participants on where the Green New Deal's discussions resonate and connect with the Global South. Do Green New Deal's discussions address the colonial North-South dynamics and inequalities, and to what extent? What does a global feminist decolonial and reparations proposal look like? How should feminists in the Global South position themselves in relation to the Green New Deal conversations, both at home and internationally? These questions will be addressed in the following conversation, moderated by Nancy Kachingwe from South Feminist Futures Zimbabwe and Nilanjana Mukia from South Feminist Futures in India. Please note, although the conversation is in English, one of the speakers, Gabriela Mendes Chavez from Agrarian South Network in Brazil, will make her contributions in Portuguese. I'll now hand over to Nancy and Nilanjana to introduce the session and their guests.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Nancy Kachingwe. I'm based in Harare. I'm one of the coordinators of South Feminist Futures, and I'll be co-moderating with Nilanjana Mukia, who is also a coordinator. There's quite a lot of us coordinators. One of the things that we had thought about was actually looking into the history and the background of the Green New Deal. We were asking ourselves to what extent, both historically, this has been part of the Global South project, and even in a more contemporary sense, to what extent have feminists from the Global South been able to be part of articulating what a Green New Deal or a global Green New Deal has been. And certainly the time of the previous Green New Deal we know was one where imperialism and colonialism were still alive and kicking. Well, they still are, but at the time, in formal ways. So when they said nations of the world, we were not sovereign nations in that part. And even in the US, these were some of the worst moments of racism. So there is a history of the good side or the progressive side of the Green New Deal, but there's also a certain relationship that it has or doesn't have with the Global South. So we wanted to explore some of that and then ask ourselves, critique it, and then look at what else has there been, what thinking has there been from the South in terms of us starting our own sort of discussions and thinking about not just the terminology, the ideas, but also what's left out in the way it's evolved. So this is part of the reason for us having this. We hope we're going to enjoy it. I'm going to hand over to Nilanjana to introduce our panel of fabulous feminists. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks everyone. And thank you, AP, for accepting this and giving us this space to discuss the Green New Deal or New Green Imperialism, ? Maybe a statement. So let me introduce our absolutely wonderful panelists, and many of whom had already written about the Green New Deal and examined the Green New Deal. So I would encourage them when they have a minute to also post the links, and I'm going to do the same thing. Nadia, if you can share the slide, please, and I'll introduce the panelists. I'll begin with Gabriela Mendes Chavez, who's our sister in Brazil. She's South Feminist Futures Brazil. Gabriela is an economist from PUC SP and holds a master's degree in world political economy from ABC Federal University. She is also the founder of No Front Financial Empowerment, a financial education platform aimed at the Black community in Brazil. And Gabriela has told us that this is the entry point for radicalization as well. It's not just a simple, financial education program. She conducts research in the areas of political economy, labor, gender, racial issues, and public policy. Welcome, Gabriela, and thank you so much. I'll introduce the next panelist. Bhumika Muchhala with the Third World Network. Bhumika is a decolonial global justice advocate, analyst, writer, and movement leader. We all know her, I'm sure. She has 20 years of experience on international financial architecture, sustainable development, feminist economics, and structural inequalities. As a senior policy advocate at the Third World Network, she engages in UN conferences and negotiations, as well as on G20, IMF, and World Bank policies. She is a PhD candidate in political economy and decolonial theory and at the New School in New York, and has a master's degree in development economics from London School of Economics. Originally from India, she grew up in Indonesia, and now she is in New York. Thank you so much, Bhumika, for joining us, and apologies for the very early start. I hope you have coffee with you. And let me introduce our next panelist, Priya Lukka. She's a visiting fellow at Goldsmiths University of London. Priya is a development and humanitarian professional experienced in designing and implementing high-level policy advocacy and campaigning. Based on innovative economic thinking, she has worked with policymakers and funders across the world on a wide range of issues, from the creation of green and decent jobs, debt, and intersectional fiscal policy design. Priya was also the first ever female chief development economist for Christian Aid, leading relationships with the UN, the World Bank, providing her with the relationships and context needed to challenge unequal power at its heart. Thank you, Priya, for joining us. And I'll move on to the last panelist, Emilia. Emilia is, I am wondering whether I should commit the crime of trying to pronounce this. I think I'll stick with English. Equidad de Género, gender equity, citizenship, work, and family. Emilia specializes in gender-responsive public policies and budgets linked to sustainable development, including comprehensive disaster risk management and climate change. Emilia is currently the programs director at Equidad, programs director of policies and budgets for equality and sustainable development. She is the co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development and a co-lead of the Beijing +25 Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition. Thank you, everyone. Thank you and welcome. And we really hope to have an enriching discussion with you and see where we go from this discussion. I'll hand back to Nancy to start us off. Welcome and thank you, everyone.
Great. We were going to have try and keep this interactive and conversational. We will have a couple of questions that we'll ask each of our speakers. We've got to respond to. Short responses, and by then we'll have covered everything. So we had actually specifically said, don't worry about presentations, just a few talking points for each of these. But let's maybe start with the sort of background to we are assuming that most people know what the Green New Deal is. If any of you would like to say a couple of words about that, but more a question of these framings of a New Deal, there's also been a global Marshall Plan that has come into these kinds of vocabulary around recovery, post-COVID and climate change. So these framings, which are very much based in Northern templates lifted from the histories in the West, is it unfair, or are we being unfair to say that this is a bit of knowledge imperialism of a certain kind, and or is it something we should embrace, question, or critique? I'd like to ask Bhumika to kick us off on those points, and then maybe Emilia, and then Priya, and then Gabriela can add. I will help you keep some time to just say, could you keep your answers to 2 or 3 minutes?
Yes. Hi, I hope you can hear me. So just to kick off, in the last, maybe the last 2 years, the last 2.5 years, I've been trying to really center what exactly would a decolonial approach, a decolonial sort of methodology, so to speak, look like for a global Green New Deal? What would be some of the systemic transformations required, some of the key principles, the way that the paradigm would need to shift? So the approach I come from is that the Green New Deals being articulated today, primarily in the European Union, the United States, including the Korean Green New Deal, are by and large the OECD developed countries. And the articulation of Green New Deal in developed countries, unfortunately, even in this time of a pandemic, which clearly shows what the dire repercussions are of a failure of multilateralism, most of the national Green New Deals do not take into account the impacts it would have, the implications, the actual sort of structures between different countries and different regions. So it would be critical for a Green New Deal to be global, with the implicit understanding that there is no country or region on the planet that exists in isolation, that our world is inextricably interdependent through trade, human capital, climate, refugee, all levels of flows and interactions. So what we are calling for essentially is an internationalist, intersectional, and truly global Green New Deal. And this would need to be grounded in certain paradigm shifts. It would need to be grounded in systemic transformations. So when we say systemic transformations, what exactly do we mean? We mean challenging the characteristics of the world we live today, challenging the realities, the first being that of neoliberalism, and that its enduring agenda of liberalization, privatization, and deregulation would need to shift. The second characteristic would be that of financialization, where we see a green financialization that is being proposed as the ingredients of a Green New Deal. And that means nature-based solutions, it means green grabbing, it means carbon markets, it means the enclosure of green spaces all over the global south for private actors to offset their carbon guilt, so to speak, resulting in all kinds of dispossession and displacement of indigenous peoples, of rural peoples, of peoples of the global south. So we see that almost all the sort of solutions are grounded in essentially the paradigm of neoliberalism, which has at its core intellectual monopoly capitalism and intellectual property rights. And we see how that is playing out with the vaccine apartheid. So on all levels, we see that as long as the actual approaches are still firmly grounded in the unjust structures of the world, of the global economy, of the global trade, of human society today, we are not actually going to have a Green New Deal. We're going to have essentially greenwashing, which is what's taking place today, because what's happening clearly is that private capital is looking for all these opportunities and gateways to utilize the Green New Deal to further advance their frontiers, to further expand in new green ways. So it's very much the opposite of what we are looking for, which is not simply putting people and planet first, but really overturning these paradigms so that it's based on public goods. It's based on an understanding of the commons. It's based on technology transfer. So we're really talking about structural shifts that would be necessary.
Thank you, Bhumika, for getting us going in that very enthusiastic set of points. And you are talking about a paradigm shift. So I will ask Emilia if she feels that this is what her thoughts are to add on to what Bhumika has said in terms of paradigm shifts and greenwashing. Whether you agree or disagree, feel free to push back and add some of your points onto that.
Hello, everybody. So happy to be here with all of you, and very timely this invitation now that everybody's jumping on the wagon on the Global Green New Deal. So I think it's very much crucial not only to see what are the impacts on the ground, but also what are the global solutions that we're hearing about more often, and the incapacity of those solutions to really address the problem at its core. So I would never dare to challenge Bhumika on any of these issues, but rather I'm very happy to learn from her. I just want to say, I think it first to start making the connections with the because crisis is that a historical crisis of the global north to the world. And that is because they have emitted most of the carbon emissions so far, and they have led humanity and the life as we know it in this planet to be on the verge of extinction, and with lots of harm, material harm, humanitarian harm. And that is a historical debt that those who are pretending to solve the problem are the ones who are causing it. And that is something that we need to say for start. And it's not something that was done in the past and is relieved now. Many of the solutions that are proposed in the Global Green New Deal related to net zero targets, to geoengineering, related to climate finance, that is 70% is consisting mostly on debt to developing countries, to poorer countries that are receiving all of the harsh impacts of climate change, and that are actually in no means to dwell with those impacts that they never caused in the first place and are paying with so much interest. So what I want to say, emphasize, and just following in the conversation that Nancy started us on the colonial dynamic of the whole situation, of the origins of the problem, and then on the type of solutions we're being imposed, in which all of those who committed all of the problem are now profiting with the solutions on behalf of this colonial and imperialist framing. So I think that this is precisely the best starting point for having this conversation. Second, I just also wanted, there have been many people who are trying to take those notions and trying to shift them. For instance, even UNCTAD, Richard Kosul wrote up saying, if we're going to work on a global Green New Deal, we need to understand where it's coming from, and that those who are the most powerful are the ones that are to blame. And it's not necessarily calling for specific negotiating groups. It's also about the dynamics and the ruling, the normative dimension of the financial and the economic system that is allowing a multiplicity of actors to profit from the problem, and therefore the solutions are also part of that profiting and expanding their imperialistic ways. So I think I find it interesting, the invitation that you're all making us in proposing, in really targeting, if there is some sort of ownership of that notion of the global, it has to be feminist and colonial, of course, does that entails. And that cannot be stopped in the origin of the so-called solutions that we are being proposed, but really going into, again, to challenge the economic and financial systems. And that is very important, starting, for instance, with democratizing the international architecture, but also addressing not only the debt crisis, but also the tax crisis, etc. I won't dwell into, because we have all time to talk about it, but really it's just to say, for instance, that it is inefficient the way that the financial solutions are seen. We hear that 100 billions will be allocated every year to the Green Climate Fund by rich countries. We haven't reached in any year those 100 billions. We've only achieved 80, I think, last year. But then in the past 5 years, 3 trillions were flowing from private banks to fossil fuels. So this tells us not only about the inadequacy of the solutions, but really the obscene profiting that all of the actors that are based in the global north are taking out of the extinction of life and of the planet as we know it, of exposing the lives of people in the global south. And just before I leave, I just want to show you my background because this is a chart, a pie showing that this thing in yellow is the value produced by women in unpaid domestic and care work in the world. So this is non-monetized value. This is non-paid. This here in the yellow stripe is voluntary work. And this final purple pink is monetized value. This is all of the money that exists in the world. And so here you will see here in this purple line, that is domestic work that is paid out of the work, the profiting of all of the other actors. Just wanted to say how women are really at the bottom of the exploitation that we're seeing in the world. So because of the sexual division of labor, but the other division of labor that we need to mind in our solution of a feminist and decolonial is precisely the geographic division of labor, which is all of this profiting that the global north is making out of our produce, our manufacture, our forests, our nature, but also our workers and the violation of human rights that are happening in the global south that is precisely feeding on this relentless and neoliberal capitalism and imperialism from the global north. So I think those are precisely the issues that are at stake when we're trying to talk in those terms of the global Green New Deal, but what would that mean in our own terms? I'm going to leave it at that. I'm very look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Emilia. And you've taken us further in terms of looking at how the current responses to the climate change crisis have been unfolding. The Green New Deal was one way of addressing that, but I think it's fair to say that we've been very unhappy about through the UNFCCC processes, for example. We've been quite unhappy about many of the responses and the false solutions that have come up in those frameworks. And the sort of Green New Deals were supposed to maybe offer some level of a shift in that paradigm. And I'd like to ask Priya, what is your feeling? Are we making too much of a fuss about the terminology? Is it what's in a name? You have also written some critique around this issue about Green New Deals or Green New Imperialism. So maybe you could share some thoughts around those sorts of questions in terms of what you think we should do moving forward in terms of responding or adding and contributing to these discussions. Please go ahead.
Just echoing what everyone said, it's just great to be in this space, great to have this kind of discussion at this important time as we build up to the COP discussions in just over a month away now. From my perspective, we need an economy that delivers reparations in terms of tools, mechanisms, and models to achieve fairer, equitable redistribution and dismantling of wealth, along with a reversal of power. And they're key features of what we would want to see in an ideal Green New Deal. And I think the current way that, a lot of the framing has been kind of put together, I do think that the language has been kind of, it kind of reflects the kind of current model and it current kind of change within the current system. And I think that it's kind of, part of kind of the policy machine, or the kind of way in which policy is, used as this kind of marginal change kind of mechanism. And I think that what would be really inspiring would be to really think about the idea and recognize the reality that the majority, global majority of people are not responsible for climate change and should be compensated for the damage climate change has on their lives and livelihoods. And actually the countries that most urgently need to adapt are faced with intellectual property restrictions and all of the unequal power dynamics around open access technology, which is biased against them. So really, actually, there is it's a profound interconnected social and ecological crisis, and it requires, therefore, profound transformation at all levels. So whilst I think the Green New Deal is brilliant in kind of collating a lot of the energy, it's really missing a dialogue that's really important on reparations. And although, the kind of popularization of climate justice at this time about inequitable outcomes for different people and different places and the vulnerability to climate impacts, I think that has definitely, been rooted in this Green New Deal. But I think the idea of climate change and colonialism, the structural practice of where countries have exploited and taken the power of other countries, and we usually typify that as global north to global south, if those constructs even work. I think that's really difficult still, because it still misses the nuance of repair and restore and kind of put at the heart people's lives and how they are real life affected, what the real life dynamics are. So I think that there is still a lot to go in terms of kind of really thinking about some of the movements for reparations that are there all across the world, that are fighting for change across different climate disasters, and that are fighting against big multinationals, big government deals, big land deals, and why the language of that kind of repair and restore kind of framework hasn't yet made it and hasn't become center stage in a deal that is there to kind of, supposedly redistribute and equitably tackle the biggest crisis we're facing right now.
Thank you, Priya. Thanks. Focusing on reparations and repair and restoring is something that, we often tend to have quite a long list of things, and then there's reparations at the end. And, maybe we need to start with the reparations and then do the rest of the list and be like, if we really want to turn this on its head, why don't we start with the reparations and all the things before we talk about tax or anything else, to also talk about the principle in terms of what this represents in how we are all in our different locations relating to what a Green New Deal is supposed to mean in a relational perspective, north-south, from gender perspectives and capital, labor, etc. But I'll ask Gabriela, bringing the perspective from Brazil. I'm not sure. Gabriela was going to speak in Portuguese, but I'm not sure if there's the Green New Deal in Portuguese.
Vou falar em português, utilizar a estrutura de tradução que a gente tem nesse festival e celebrar nossas potencialidades e diferenças. Acordo total, e ainda estou vibrando com todas as questões colocadas pelas companheiras, e queria pegar num ponto específico, trago pela Priya, que é essa questão da reparação. Quando a gente discute esse acordo verde global, é preciso observar primeiro que essa questão ambiental ela se desdobra em muitas outras questões, porque afeta diretamente a reprodução social e as condições mínimas de vida de todos os seres humanos na Terra. E também existe um processo histórico para toda essa questão ambiental que a gente vê hoje, né? Então, é muito importante que a responsabilidade em torno dessa questão, ela seja, de fato, dividida proporcionalmente, né? E aí é importante a gente pensar que, quando a gente fala desse equilíbrio, os povos do Sul já estão levantando alternativas há muito tempo, mas essas alternativas, elas demandam que a gente reveja a estrutura e o sistema como um todo. O modo de produção ao qual a gente vem tendo até aqui, ele se mostra absolutamente insustentável, e nessa conjuntura, né, nessa regressão que a gente vem vendo da conjuntura, a gente vê as mulheres, as pessoas negras e as pessoas indígenas e os povos originários sofrendo todos os efeitos da destruição causada pelo capital, né? Então, acho importante a gente trazer a perspectiva da professora Jayati Ghosh, por exemplo, que fala que o Green Deal, na verdade, precisa ser multicolorido, né? Esse acordo para o paradigma do século XXI, ele precisa englobar, com certeza, a questão ambiental, mas é fundamental que a gente também enderece as questões da desigualdade social, as questões de gênero, que foram muito bem aqui colocadas, e para isso, todas essas questões, a gente precisa necessariamente falar também de reparação, né, e sobre como todos esses processos históricos, eles subordinaram grupos ao longo da história em detrimento do favorecimento econômico de outros, assim. E acho que um ponto muito importante também para a gente ter atenção é do perigo da financiarização desse problema ambiental, né, que no final do dia não resolve o nosso problema, cria aí um outro mercado especulativo e não resolve o problema da emissão de poluentes e o problema da insustentabilidade produtiva que a gente vive hoje nesse momento. Vamos continuar.
And indeed we are going to keep going. Thanks all for your introductory remarks in this first round. And I think that what one of the main messages coming through is that what we have on the table is missing lots of elements, including possibly even what these Green New Deal's starting point is, either national and not thinking globally, working within a sort of neoliberal paradigm and not really seeking to overturn that, often leaving out. And I think even many... We are critiquing a set of proposals that are not coming from the World Bank. They're coming from, people we would also consider often comrades and allies. But it's important, we feel, to pick some of these issues apart so that even in the conversations we can say what's missing, is it delivering what we need, and how can we change that? And if it doesn't, then do we still call it a Green New Deal, or do we need to call it something else that we generate on our own that fits in with what we want? But I'm going to pass on for the next round of contributions to Nalangela and take us to the next question about what we do now. How do we tackle some of these gaps and contradictions?
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks, everyone. I think you've already gotten us started and sort of led us to the next question, which is what does the Green New Deal as it stands mean for the Global South? I think all of you have sort of reflected on some of that. You've kind of shorthanded, and what I want you to do is go into greater detail in a brief, maybe three minutes. Tell us what it means for the Global South as the Green New Deal stands now, and I'll start with Priya.
Thanks. So as it stands now, I think that there is no recognition of historical responsibility and global dependency. there is a lack of acknowledgement of specific harms and impacts experienced, particularly by marginalized and minoritized and racialized communities. And I don't know the degree to which, because those two things are so glaring, I think there is a need to think about participatory processes to engage civil society representing groups, like just do that in much greater magnitude. And I think this disregard of the impacted communities is a repeated pattern that we've seen inflicted by neoliberalism, with no active effort to acknowledge or address the consequences of extractive economic and business models that have been forced on these settings, on these countries, on these communities. And really the green initiatives that are encouraged as part of kind of the solutions and the policy ideas that accompany the kind of whole policy apparatus around the Green New Deal is still, you know, in some ways, when you kind of really dissect what it will mean, there's still, it's like an extension of racial capitalism, but it's characterized almost as green growth. So when you see like loans that take advantage of the financial instability of countries and exacerbate their debts and reinforce this subordination, you really see, like, you know, a real concern about the asymmetric power dynamics being reinforced by a deal. So I think the deal really needs to kind of, you know, think about, like, you know, all of these elements that
I want to reflect on that as well. Please do go ahead. And I'm going to ask Emilia to come in. Tell us what is the impact on the global South, on women, on marginalized folks.
Thank you, Niranjana. I would be very happy if you can share also what are your options in reframing the terms. I mean, it's very enticing, you know, to go into this conversation, because indeed, I think it was Boris Johnson who started to talk also very directly about the Marshall Plan. And I was like, it's so insulting. It's like, right. And somehow the term Global Green New Deal has passed through and it has the same connotations as calling it Marshall Plan. But I think it's also something that it's a discussion that has been there for a couple of years now, and it's going through. I think it has different layers. Let me just point out into the feminist one. I'm sure my colleagues will try to dig deep further into other dimensions. But I think at this moment, the focus on just transition, you know, a just transition towards a new economy, a new mode of production that is not relying on carbon, that is not relying on the supposedly on this extra intensive extraction, but without telling us how. It's also implying, let me focus on the people here, about a just transition of the workforce. Right. And it supposedly says that, for instance, if you have a community that is focused more on providing labor for extraction, let us say oil, etc., and then how are you going to transition that into a full community, a full town, a full society, transition towards a new mode of production that would mean diversifying the economy and stuff like that. And in the case of labor, of course, that means capacity building, transferring to new jobs so that you don't have that phenomena that is leaving ghost towns of people unemployed massively, because now the new fashion is green energy, etc. So it's like, how are you going to move the production from one sector to the other? And that in itself poses a lot of questions from the gender lens. Because, for instance, we know that all of the sectors, by the way, let me go back, all of the sectors that produce the environmental emergency are sectors with male predominance labor force. And it's due to the sexual division of labor that is also extrapolated to the gender social order. So energy, transportation, infrastructure, even massive agricultural produce of the monoculture, it's linked to male employment, and those are the ones that have produced all of this massive environmental problem. So without a feminist view, it would mean that you're taking all of this this massive labor work to another sector that is exactly the same. And that means that you're giving employment, capacity building, access to transfer, to technology transfer, etc., to men from one point to the other, and women who had been producing all of this and pay domestic and care work and carrying all of the burden of all of the crisis and now even considered shock absorbers will be left aside of the equation, both in the previous scheme and now in the future one, because this notion of a larger scheme that involves not only the monetized work but also the non-monetized is out of the equation of the new global Green New, of the global Green New Deal as we are thinking about it. So it is very important not only to consider, let us say, the labor market, but also the relation between time use and the value of the work that is created, both monetized and non-monetized. And this is why, for instance, I think for us feminists, it's not only a matter of we're talking about what are the impacts on the ground for women who are, let us say, defending and in the emergency and receiving the harsher impacts, and sometimes really carrying on the communities themselves. But in the solutions, are we thinking really about how to make this equation in bringing also the dimension of unpaid domestic and care work fully to a new dimension? First, even just in terms of the new employments, are we bringing parity? Are we bringing maternity leave, paternity leaves, and even time use in formal schedules, etc., for a new reconfiguration of employment towards the future? If this is the moment in which we are reconfiguring employment because of the emergency, then we have to make it right. And it doesn't mean only paid work. It doesn't mean only social protection for those who are in informal labor. It also means to make this full reconfiguration of all of that stands here, and it's also supporting life. And I don't think we have made that equation. And I haven't even dwelled into the economic and financial dynamics, but I think this issue of the just transition without making the connection with the sexual division of labor, and what does it mean in terms of the macro dimension in inequality, gender inequalities, we're going to leave a full moment that we're considering transitioning from one mode of production to another. I'm not saying we're in the right path, even with the scheme that we're doing, but I think the challenge, it goes beyond saying, let's give employment to this group of people so that, just transfer from one to another. The challenge is huge. And of course, in thinking about sectorial opportunities versus risks in regional settings and in community settings, that is adding a whole of new challenges that we need to see also in terms of reparations. I totally with Priya and all of you on that. As the transition moves on, we cannot just think that we're starting from a blank sheet. There are many layers of power imbalances that need to be taken care of before we're just thinking it's just about moving from one sector to another because we're just diversifying the economy. I think it's not that simple. And from the feminist point of view, this is a key demand that we must be asking from the start. I'm going to stop here. Very keen to listen to our colleagues.
Thanks, Emilia. And I think that when you ask the question how, that is the key question, right? I mean, the devil is in the detail. I hate saying that, but it literally is, right? And the how and just transition for whom. So the international sexual division of labor as well. So if you're looking at paid or unpaid labor, it is because of macroeconomic policies and neoliberalism in the South that you have the global care chains that is, so it's a whole sort of, even with the feminist, the care and climate policy, there is a gap in terms of the global care chain and what impact that has on women in the global South. So thanks for bringing in the labor question squarely. And I'll move on to Gabriela. Gabriela, what does it, as it stands, what does the global or the Green New Deal mean for the global South?
Bom, sorry, let me change here Bom, acho que o Green New Deal, da forma que se apresenta, ele também pode configurar um elemento de exclusão dos países do sul global, na medida em que existem muitos investimentos a serem realizados para a mudança da matriz produtiva, investimentos tecnológicos, investimentos na mudança mesmo de paradigmas. O próprio Banco Mundial tem financiado alguns países que têm projetos aí de desenvolvimento sustentável, e é importante a gente pensar que isso requer uma mudança na matriz produtiva do mundo inteiro, né? O Sul, hoje, é responsável por produzir a agricultura e a agropecuária que alimenta o Norte, né? Como é que estão sendo pensadas aspectos sustentáveis nessa dimensão da produção alimentar, por exemplo? Como é que está sendo pensado na dimensão das próprias indústrias transnacionais, que muitas vezes têm seus polos no sul global para a produção de mercadorias? Todo esse fluxo do capital global precisa ser pensado, e o nosso papel dentro dessas relações internacionais também precisa ser pensado. Nesse momento, a maior parte das nossas economias vive crises extremamente profundas, com altíssimos níveis de desemprego, o que tem piorado substancialmente a vida e a qualidade de vida da maior parte da população. Quando a gente fala da questão alimentar, por exemplo, existe um problema estrutural de aumento de preços dos alimentos, especialmente no sul global, sendo que nós produzimos esses alimentos, mas esses alimentos eles estão sendo produzidos num modelo agroexportador que não garante às populações locais um mínimo de segurança alimentar. Então, de fato, pensar no modelo verde de desenvolvimento requer a gente pensar a matriz produtiva como um todo, e não apenas pensar na questão da emissão de poluentes. No caso do Brasil, a gente tem um desmatamento imenso da floresta amazônica, que envolve a desapropriação substancial de povos originários e quilombolas, e tudo isso é feito em nome do progresso. Tudo isso é feito em nome da economia e do modelo econômico que a gente tem hoje, que é um modelo agroexportador. Então, em linhas gerais, para a gente falar, né, de um modelo verde aqui no Sul, a gente precisa repensar o modelo da matriz produtiva do mundo como um todo, porque, de outra forma, continuaremos marginalizados e sem a tecnologia necessária para fazer as mudanças necessárias.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabriela. That was, and you're linking it to food security, which is so important, and I know that's the work you do as well. So, thank you for bringing that in. We hadn't sort of factored that in. Thanks, Gabriela. Bhumika, you had started to talk about green financialization, green colonialism, green imperialism. Tell us more about that. What does it, as it stands, what does it mean? Break it down for us.
Hi. Yes. So I'd just like to really briefly emphasize the key points on specifically on reparations, because and just that leads into imperialism on the green scale. But the concepts of restitution, of redress and repair, it needs to account for a really long history. We're talking about at least half a millennia, and so it's on so many multiple intersectional levels. It's ecological, it's feminist, it's it's commodity based, it's consumption and production, it's the ways in which, as Gabriela rightly mentioned, the South has been used as the plantation grounds for the North. It's financial, it's monetary. So the repair is so very intersectional. There's so many different layers to it. And in these layers, one of the key issues is that when we understand equity and where the historically plundered peoples and regions of the world are de facto creditors of both financial and climate debt. So, following Emilia's call, it's incredibly necessary for us to redefine these terms, to redefine the taxonomy, the actual classifications, low income, developing, who is a creditor, who is a debtor. And that, when we're talking about climate debt in particular and climate reparations, it is completely connected to historical, financial, ecological, social, feminist. And it's not simply owing, or it's not simply a matter of compensation. In fact, that is a small percentage of it. It's really the attempt of structural change, of non-repetition, of actual transformation of the systems in place, right? Of production, distribution, consumption. But, specifically, we're talking about ending extractivism, ending a carbon-based model, right? So it is really that imagination that is required to reimagine and reformulate. Not just simply, we cannot exactly go back to the past and copy paste. We cannot exactly say that we're going to live life the way we did before the advent of industrialization around 1829. But we can really reformulate and reimagine what is an equitable, enjoyable, absolutely dignified world. What does that look like? What does that look like for the global South in terms of the ending of structural dependency, in terms of food self-sufficiency, in terms of nurturing biodiversity, in terms of putting women at the very center, not just acknowledging that they are the stewards of environmental preservation and flourishment, but that they are the holders of wisdom and knowledge that must not be extracted and made into patents. And that really leads into the discussion on imperialism and what does green imperialism today look like. I think green imperialism today has many different facets on trade, on finance, and specifically on green financialization. But I'll just expand on the green financialization for just a second. So the way in which green financialization is looking like today was really head off by the BlackRock CEO in a recent G20 meeting, just I believe in in July 2021, just 2 months ago. The BlackRock CEO, which really leads a small group of Wall Street firms that have been pushing enormous amounts of portfolio capital or financial investments that are not productive investments. They're not producing anything. They are gambling. They're part of the speculative economy and investing in different assets. And since the global financial crisis of 2008, there's been a huge surge of this kind of private money flows into developing countries. So this Larry Fink, who's the chief executive officer of BlackRock, he firmly said that climate change represents a 50 trillion opportunity for investors, and then stated that, they are going to be at the forefront of this new frontier of investments. Now, let's consider these are the same financial institutions that are the major investors in fossil fuels. They are the same financial institutions that are basically calling for carbon markets. Just make the polluters pay. That is not what the principle of polluters pay means. Polluters pay principle was put into place in the Rio Principles along with common but differentiated responsibility to say that it is the obligation of the polluter to redress the wrong of pollution and ecological damage. This is a sort of inversion in the carbon market. And what they are calling for with this kind of investment is specifically that the actual regulations of developing countries of the global south must now incentivize this kind of money that goes into carbon enclosure, into green products and services, and that penalize carbon emissions. It's incredibly important that we recognize that green imperialism is about penalizing, punishing carbon emissions from the global south when the technology transfer for putting into place renewable technology is not being made available. The patents are not being made available. The technological know-how and the unequal trade relations that make importing equipment so expensive and in foreign currency denomination. There's so many layers and layers of structures that make it so difficult for the global south to put into place the kind of, carbon-free and low-carbon emissions production processes. So it comes into the granular of you're punishing the global south for high carbon emissions when you've also relegated them and inserted them into those high carbon emissions production dependency. They're dependent on producing the raw materials. They've been made, global south, we've been made dependent on producing high fossil fuel based raw materials and commodities. Let's talk about steel, all kinds of natural gas, all kinds of fossil fuel derivatives, coal especially. So this isn't necessarily by choice. This has been a long process of the raw commodities, the materials, the lowest value added materials for consumption, for the high consumption lifestyle in the north, to come from the south. So on every level, it's a logjam, right? From intellectual property rights, renewable energy, from historical structures of production, feminization of labor. So when we're talking about green imperialism, it is using these unequal structures and intensifying them instead of redressing them. Intensifying them because it provides great incentives for private capital. So, of course, we know all that's need to be done to undo this logjam. But where is the political will? Where is the power of the people to counter the power of Wall Street? And there, I think it's got to be a revitalization of social movements on a scale that we have not seen yet.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhumika. That was such an important intervention. And I wish that we had more time. Maybe we need to have another conversation, sort of just picking this apart, because I don't think that a lot of us, even though there is a lot of interest, we're not paying enough attention to the details of this. So I would say that we need another sort of, remember when we used to meet in person? We need another, we need a long meeting to pick this apart. Thank you so much for that, Bhumika. And I'm not going to try and summarize. I think what you said was incredibly important. I also see that a lot of people are sort of writing questions in, and please do feel free to ask. Just reflect on those questions. I think we have important questions and reflections coming in on chat as well. And just speak. It is supposed to be free flowing, and so please speak to those questions as well. I think there is a really interesting question and a very, very true question on the Marshall Plan, and what that meant in terms of destroying sort of left alternatives and creating a unipolar world. I'm just going to move us on to the next question. I also recognize that we are running a little late, which is sort of what are the proposals that have come from the Global South, whether it's from states or movements. So over here, and I know that some of you all have written about these. If you can reflect on the proposals from the Global South and what that means in the context of the climate crisis. And I'm going to start with Emilia. Emilia over here.
Yes, thank you so much, and very much enjoying the inputs of all of my colleagues. Just wanted to say that from our end, in working also with the economic justice movement, it's rather than jumping into the latest trend of discussion, it's very important to keep in mind the structural demands and keep at them, because without these being addressed, there will never be any solution for any problem that humanity is facing now. So, we've been as Women's Working Group and for Development, we've been coordinating this campaign of campaigns that it's a proposal to add on a package of demands, all of them related to macro solutions for the people and the planet that are needed for really addressing at its core the problems that we are facing collectively. So one emphasis is precisely to say that, of course, there is a lack of democratic processes at the global level. All of the decision makers are in the end those who are linked to the origin of the problems. So when we have now a problem, an environmental problem, it is again the richest and the wealthiest countries, the ones that are coming up with this package to supposedly solve the environmental crisis. When we have addressing the debt crisis, it is the Paris Club, and these are the lenders that are really overinflating the interest rates for the poorest countries. When we're talking about the tax measures, it's OECD protecting actually those who are placing tax havens for those of the wealthiest countries, and on and on. So I think from the start is like accumulation of impunity and of power abuse by the global north in all of the fields. And therefore, this is why it's so relevant to have proposals from the global south, because we cannot really leave the decisions into the hands of those who are responsible. And I recall Bhumika saying in another meeting, it's the same responsibles for all of the problems, right? So, and they're also rotating from one table to the other, and as though it were a different problem, different actors, because it's falling under a different name, but it's the same. And it's really, I've been thinking about strategic litigation, but it's like I'm finding out that it takes like 15 years to follow for a process. So I think also even the procedures of access to justice, I think that is another conversation we really need to have, because what is binding, what is voluntary, what is policy, and what are the means that we have to access justice. I think we're at this point in which we really need to take that into consideration. So that is something that I really wanted to say. And the campaign of campaigns, rather than saying this is our proposal of Global Green New Deal, is rather a package of elements that we really need to address in order to really deal with all of this multi-layered crisis. And I was mentioning also already debt and illicit financial flows, but it means at the level of what are the social, environmental, and economic impacts of technology and digital technology, but overall of the usage of technology. And again, it's also a point of entry for the imperialism, which the global north relates to the south. And I don't want to leave this opportunity to say even the access to vaccines and the way in which there is waiver now, it's trillions of bets in the global south. It's not detached from the proposals that we need to make in a whatever deal we need to make between the North and the Global South. It cannot just happen. It's breaking the lives, entire communities, and access to social protection, and promoting so many human rights violations. So it's really a package more of a environmental or green proposals. Is really dealing with the impacts of all of the actors that are causing harm, including, for instance, another element of public-private partnerships. We've seen also in the comments here and people saying the problem is that when you have supposedly damages by a group of countries and you say, so now we're giving the solution to the private finance, and it's like not seeing that private finance is the thing that led us from the beginning to this problem that we're at. And the thing is, if we do not regulate and control private finance, it's 300% bigger and larger than public finance. So at this moment, the role of private sector is crucial, especially corporations, but we do not see in dealing with microanalysis or dealing with what is going to happen at the solutions at the community level or micro dealings, we're not seeing the huge impact of this 300% larger than public, because we keep on doing this traditional advocacy work with governments, but this larger share of how the world is working right now takes us to really even go beyond PPPs, public-private partnership. Is really dealing with the financial, with the financial sector instruments, but also actors, plus all of the private actors that are out there acting. For instance, also in the trade dynamics with all of the impunity, etc. And at the end, I will just mention we need also to review the ODA framework. Many people is very concerned about ODA, but it's like really peanuts in comparison to what at stake in the relation between Global South and the Global North. It's an imperialist form of assigning conditionalities, and at this point, it's very cheap, let us say, for Global North to manipulate our countries to say you have to agree to our deals in our terms, because I'm going to remove ODA to you, official development assistance. And I think we're at a point of no return in which our governments and as citizens and movements need to move away from those deals on ODA to really talk about the huge dynamics. So rather than pointing out what is the proposal on our end, or if there is any proposal from the Global South I support, I think we need to go back to the basic and keep on advocating for larger demands and transformation at the global and economic financial systems, and keep on moving them rather than, or if we're falling into the trap of the name Global Green New Deal, and I will just recall that means bringing all of those elements in the equation, and not talking about, green funding or private funding or just let us say, agreeing with including more women into the boards of decision-making of green companies, because that is really not going to cut the deal for all of us. I'm going to stop here.
Thanks, Emilia. We had another question that we wanted, a really important one, so I called for another such session. But I just want, and Bhumika, and I wanted you to speak about the NIEO and the Cochabamba People's Declaration, and within the context of how these are erased and these are destroyed, the right to development, all of these, all of these things that have come from the proposals that have come from the South. What are they, and why have they been, erased of our own memories? Okay, I'll start with Bhumika. Priya has care responsibilities, so she had dropped me a message. Bhumika, do you want to start us off? We have 9 minutes, so you can go for like 3.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me? There's this, okay, yes. Yes, so basically, this is such an important question, Nilanjana, and thank you for mentioning New International Economic Order and the Cochabamba Declaration. And, in that vein, there are many other Global South declarations and proposals. I know the UN is a site of great contestation and chronic and embedded co-optation from the North, but there are resolutions and outcome documents within the UN that integrate developing countries' voices, proposals, priorities. So essentially, when we're talking about a new international economic order, right, we're talking about the newly independent countries of the global South, 1955, in terms of political independence, in that the colonizers had physically left. They had retreated back in their big ships and in with some of their colonial officers, but they had left behind very much the historical structures and inequalities that are structural. They had also left in place a kind of system of sub-imperialism, of satellite states, where the historically plundered regions continue to continue to be satellites, or continue to be grounds and resources for the accumulation of wealth and resources, and the drain from the South to the North that continues today in ever more sophisticated, ever more aggressive ways. It has become infinitely more sophisticated and aggressive when we talk about the sheer scale of money being siphoned from the South to the North through tax injustice, tax evasion and avoidance, through debt repayments. In interest payments alone, the South has financed the North with over $4.2 trillion since the 1980s. So that's just an interest payment alone, not to mention all the different layers of financial resources going from the South to the North. What the new international economic order was trying to do in 1955 was exactly this, was to recognize that the colonizers may have left physically, but the structures of dependency very much remain. So the new international economic order was concerned with the unequal trade relations. We're selling bananas and getting the revenue for bananas, but we're buying their technological equipment, their machinery. We're paying the royalties for their intellectual property. This is an unequal exchange. This is the very heart of Marx's unequal exchange. So the new international economic order was concerned with the technological content of production. They were concerned with the ownership of production. They were concerned with structures of power in the global economy. They were concerned with the voice of developing countries in the global decision-making. They wanted to build autonomous institutions in the South to counter and this is before the World Bank and IMF were even created, but there was already talk of autonomous institutions and regional associations in the South. There's been a lot of talk of a new international...
Bhumika, I'm so sorry. We literally have 5 minutes, so we've been told that we have to. But I wish we started with this, because you were on a roll, and I'm sure others would have added. But
I'll send more links. I'll just send.
Yes, please.
Absolutely.
Please do. Thank you so much, everyone. That was fantastic. And we didn't even get to the last question, may I say, which was going to be really exciting. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to the Global South Women's Forum. We are definitely, to all of the participants and panelists, we are definitely going to reconvene. This is an important discussion to have. So we will reconvene soon. I'm going to let Nancy say thank you to everyone as well. Go ahead, Nancy.
Yes, I will. I mean, we have 4 minutes. I don't know. I just wanted to ask Gabriela if you had a minute or two. I can give that to you if you want to say something just to conclude as even a way forward on this discussion. What do you think we should do?
No, I just want to say that women are resisting around the world, even at this moment. Last week, we had 4,000 indigenous women marching in the capital of Brazil, reclaiming for land rights. And I think all our debate, or from our point of view as women from the South, comes from land. And I just want to say we have, at this moment, thousands and millions of women resisting because this climate change is significant to us. It's about life. It's about everything we have. So that's what I want to say. Thank you very much for our contributions. I learned a lot at this place.
Thanks, Gabriela. Thank you.
We have to talk about reproductive debt too. We haven't talked about the reproductive debt.
Yeah, because hungry is about it.
I wanted to just have a couple of, there was something Bhumika said about having a nice life. And I thought, it's so true. Like, we're here on this, fossil fuels and climate change, and really on a survivalist, like, how can we stop the disaster? When in fact, what we should be centering our claims around is like, we want to have nice lives, sustainable, respectful of nature, equitable, but we really need to stake our claim to say, as the global South, look, we've been net contributors to this overall system, and demanding a good life for all is should not be something that's seen as a luxury that it almost is now when we're having these discussions. And the point that, Green New Deal type of arrangements, they focus on fossil fuel without really thinking about, everything that made this system in place and that sustains it. So we're talking really quite often about the end point of a system and the need for us to look at why it's structured. And maybe also asking ourselves a little bit more about these institutions. If the people who are causing the problems are supposed to be having the solutions, maybe part of our demands should be that we need new institutions, because some of them are not working and they have been causing more harm than good for a long time. They've had their time, they've had their opportunity, their solutions haven't worked. Why should we give them more? Let's have new people and new institutions coming in. So those are my few last thoughts. But thank you so much.
Thank you to Nancy and Nilanjana and their guests Bhumika, Priya, Emilia, and Gabriela. This was the 8th and final part of an 8-part series from the 2021 Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development, hosted by International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. These sessions and more are available with visuals on the eRaw YouTube page. The link is in the episode notes. Thank you for taking time to listen to the Green New Deal or Green New Imperialism episode of Sustain 267 podcast. Let's connect on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter on our handle at Sustain 267 and share your thoughts and comments and maybe even your key takeaways from this episode. The artwork for this episode was designed and illustrated by Lulu Kitololo, inspired by the conversation. Find her social media handles and website in the episode notes. I am the host of Sustain 267 podcast, Batukili Sidze, and the sound engineer is Malehoma Koti. Please subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast to listen to more conversations on climate change and environment through African voices. Take care.
Sustain 267.